The story begins with the fact that the fifth husband of the Grand Duchess has already died. It turns out that long ago it was said that this girl is a witch. People are already beginning to think that maybe it is not for nothing. One of the girls tries to silence the other and not to say such things, but the latter wonders how else it can be explained, and notes that if it were her, she would be afraid because this girl is definitely cursed. At that moment, the girl who was called a witch is near the coffin of her husband. She looks at all this and thinks that she wants to go back to her room as soon as possible. It turns out that this girl is a princess who was called the noble and beautiful flower of the kingdom, but now she is being fingered as a witch. It took only 1 year for people's opinions to change so radically about her. We also learn that she was married at 20, not of her own free will, but of her father's will, and she only dreamed of a happy married life. At the moment of marriage, the main character was very happy, because she obviously thought that everything would work out well and she would have a good family. But all her hopes for a happy life didn't last long, until her first husband died, and then her second and third husbands died. According to her, she didn't even see much difference between the fourth and fifth husbands who also died. Every time it happened, her angry father caught the culprit himself. Also, every time her father would comfort his daughter, because it obviously put a lot of psychological pressure on her, she would hug and cry into her father's chest, telling him that people around her have already started calling her a witch, a fact that is very disturbing, and she wonders to her father, is it really true? The father naturally reassures his daughter every time and tells her not to be sad, because it is not true. But the girl looks at her father and asks if this time there was a man who was unrequitedly in love with her, as it was in the previous times. She also asks her father if he will tell her something else about it. The father, holding his daughter's hand, says that he is afraid that she will be a little shocked by this story. Also, according to him, in such moments one should not despair, and right after that he says that they should hurry up with the 6th wedding. The main character is naturally very surprised by this. After all, her husband has just died, and her father is already offering her to marry for the 6th time to another man. He also asks his daughter to remember that happiness loves silence, and according to him, if they don't see her smile, they can brazenly open their mouths. The girl, who is still a little surprised at her father's decision, asks him if this wedding is the queen's personal wish. It turns out the queen is only 3 years older than the protagonist, and the queen disliked the protagonist from their first meeting, at which point the father pushes his daughter away a bit and tells her that there seems to be a slight misunderstanding between them. The protagonist is still tearfully wondering if it's more than just a misunderstanding. Suddenly, a young guy named Mad walks into the room. The protagonist immediately wipes the tears from her face and looks at the guy in surprise. He in turn answers her in the same way and just watches the beautiful Lean. That's the name of the protagonist. The king immediately tells his daughter that this is the union of two people who are very dear to him, so he will personally protect them both. The king looks very determined. The main character does not fully understand what her father is talking about. She does not understand some of his theses. For example, his words that he will protect them both, and the words about the union. The girl cannot understand what her father is talking about at all and just watches in amazement. The king immediately changed his gaze. I turned to Mad, telling him that Lien seems very surprised, so he asks the guy to explain everything to the girl. The boy naturally obeys the king's orders without question, and says he will do exactly as the king says, immediately after which His Majesty begins to leave the room, leaving the young men alone. The boy thinks about the fact that he still remembers clearly the birthday of Her Highness. He said that at that moment the whole royal palace was in a frenzy. At the time of the birth of the main character, her future husband was already 10 years old, and he was not amazed to watch the girl lying in her crib. The guy even dared to say that Her Highness has long been in his heart. The girl is a little embarrassed because of her future husband's words. It even becomes a little hard for her to believe that she was in Sir Mad's heart all this time. She immediately tried to say something, but Mad interrupted the protagonist and told her that he will be the first who will definitely not leave the princess. He even promises her that they will leave her. According to him, he will never leave the girl alone and will keep his life for her. Lien looked a little puzzled at first, but then the guy grabbed her hand and asked her what the girl thought about it. But she didn't answer him and looked toward her father and reminded him that today was her fifth husband's funeral, so she didn't think it was right to talk about it now. She also reminds us that in addition to all this, she is a witch who has killed 5 husbands. At least according to her, that's what people call her. But the king is still adamant and tells his daughter that she shouldn't pay attention to what other people say, because according to him, she is the only princess in their kingdom. The protagonist naturally thinks at this point that her father doesn't understand her at all, but then she catches herself thinking that all this thinking is just an excuse and she just doesn't want to get married. The king notices that the protagonist has begun to think about something and reminds her that he said he would protect them. He even says that he will call the Knights of the Kama and even the army of Mohanes, so that no one can even get close to them. At this point, we learn that the army of Mohanes is the army of Archduke Elegator, who rules Mohanes. This army is called the Spear of God or the Army of the Devil, because it has never lost a battle. Lien immediately wondered why her father had remained silent if he could have used this army all along. But the king interrupts his daughter's thoughts and tells her that if anything happens to her husband this time, he will never force her to marry again. According to him, the king really wants the girl to be happy. He wonders his daughter if she will trust her father one last time. The thought that this may be the last time warms the protagonist. She thinks that even if Mad dies, she will not have to marry for the 7th time. Mad in turn notices that something is wrong with the princess and says that she must be confused. And according to him, he understands her completely. Further actions of the story are moved forward to some time, thanks to persuasions of the father and his promise to keep the young man alive. The girl still agreed and married for the 6th time. While the princess was being prepared for her 7th marriage, the gays said she looked just fine. But you could see from the princess's face that she wasn't quite happy with everything that was going on. With a very sad look, Lien pondered on whether or not this look could be called beautiful. Obviously, the girl was making a reference to the fact that she looked completely broken and unhappy. The main character, who was already fully prepared for the wedding, quickly headed to the place where the celebration will be held, as suddenly at this moment from her hair falls one hairpin. A young man who had passed by the princess a little earlier immediately bent down to pick up the thing that belonged to the princess. Right after he did it and raised his head, we learn that his name is Courtesan Elator. The protagonist recognizes him. But the guy, still with a nonchalant face, hands her the thing she dropped. The girl begins to remember the last day of her ex-husband's funeral. At that moment, she was near his coffin and noticed this young man in the distance. She looked at him in surprise, and then it seemed to her as if the whole world shook. She couldn't take her eyes off him even for a second. The protagonist notices that then everything happened just like now. She once again cannot take her eyes off the Duke, but making great efforts to do it. The girl, still from embarrassment, lowers her eyes to the floor and thanks the Archduke. The guy seemed to want to say something to the main character but did not dare, and just began to bow to the girl, showing his respect for her. Then the Archduke hurriedly leaves the room they are in, while the protagonist looks at his back and thinks that she thought the Archduke had something to say to her. The protagonist also thinks about the fact that it is rumored that this place is guarded by an army of Mohanes. At the same moment, she remembers her father's words and his speech about how he said he really wanted his daughter to be happy. For a second, the girl closes her eyes and thinks about whether she will really be happy if Ser Mad survives, and immediately after these thoughts, the protagonist headed to the hall where the celebration will be held. The actions of the story are carried over to the next day, and it turns out that in the morning, as the father assured his daughter, her new husband woke up alive and unharmed. As it turns out, this is the first time that the protagonist's husband has not passed away the night after the wedding, and they can finally spend their morning together. The protagonist and her new husband meet the morning with a cup of tea, and the princess wonders if it will be like this from now on. On the same day, an end came from the king's palace to the young men to inform them that by His Majesty's order the title of Marquis had been conferred on Mad Cranchester. At this point, the protagonist is a little surprised by such news and thinks that this is a very generous gift from her father for her new husband. The guy who has just been given the title of Marquis immediately whispers to the protagonist the motive for which her father decided to make the guy a Marquis. It turns out in the kingdom, They say that it is not appropriate for a princess to have a spouse of low status. The new husband also asks his wife if this gift is not an indication of how much the king cares for his daughter. Lien says it is. It also appeared that after their marriage, the king granted their maid a great deal of land and gave them a large and very fine residence and mines, with only one question: why she was not glad. For the gifts they had received from her father should have made her more glad than she really was. She thinks that she probably doesn't feel happy about all the presents because she's so tired of everything that's going on. Married life, about which the main character so long dreamed of, peacefully went its way. She finally has a loving husband and unlimited support from her father. In the opinion of the protagonist, you could not wish her more, and everything was fine until one moment her newly married husband knocked on her door. Next to him was a boy who was very much like Mad. The main character was very surprised after seeing this boy. She did not understand what was happening. But Sir Mad, looking angrily at his wife, told her that this boy was his child. From his words, the protagonist went into shock and even dropped the flowers she was holding in her hands. Being incredibly shocked, she asks her husband if she heard correctly that he said that the boy is his son. Then she warily begins to look at the boy, and noticed that his hair and eye color were the same as Mad's. Mad himself looked a little annoyed at this point, and as if he was thinking about something, he immediately grabbed his head and said that he understood his wife's feelings, and that she was angry that he had told me about the son earlier. But then he started to justify himself, and told the protagonist that the child's mother was a courtesan who had died long ago, and that she was not an aristocrat according to him. He also reminds the protagonist that he can no longer have children, and this boy is the only descendant of the Manhwa family. It also turns out that after the wedding, Mad was diagnosed with infertility, which was the result of an accident. Then he was injured on the battlefield a few months ago. And for all this, the main character naturally never had children from her husband, and she used to think that they will never and will never be. At this time, she is still a little nervous, and they are grabbed by her dress. But Mad also says he'd like to put his son on the family registry, but he needs Lien's permission to do so. So the main character is a little surprised that he wants to put this boy on the family registry. Lien still looks shocked, but realizes that since the laws of Digriet's kingdom are very strict, he needs permission to add the child to the family registry. Lien immediately grabs her head and thinks about the fact that she can't even get angry, even though she has every right to. Right after these thoughts, she turns to one of her maids named Nail. She asks the maid to take the boy away and give him something to eat. The maid naturally obeys her mistress unquestioningly and does her bidding. After the maid left his mistress's room, Mad put his arm around his wife and asked her if she would adopt the boy. After that, the story moves to the next day. It turns out that the princess has written a letter to her father to consult with him, but she is a little worried about the consequences, and wonders what will happen if the king gets angry and punishes her husband. When the king's reply came, the girl was very much surprised, for she received a very unexpected answer. For while she was reading the letter, Mad informed her that he would do everything in his power for her and their common child. Lien, in turn, as if she didn't even pay attention to her husband and read her father's reply with shaking hands. It turned out that she thought her father would take her side, but it was different. It was in this way that the main character had an 8-year-old son at the age of 21. At first, she tried to get a little closer to him in order to establish a relationship. While the boy was playing in the street, she approached him and asked him if he wanted anything. Philip, who was not too talkative, replied that he did not need anything. And then the princess said that if the boy needed anything, he could tell her. At that moment, the boy looked at one point and said he missed his mother. It was at that moment that the protagonist realized that the boy would never call her his mother. Sometime later at a tea party, the princess tells her husband that she wants him to bring the child's mother. Mad reacts violently to this request at first and asks about the protagonist. How can she say that? After all, he has already said that his biological mother is dead, but the protagonist is convinced that his mother is alive and wonders if her husband lied to her so that she would accept the boy as her own son. Mad, who was caught in a lie once again, justifies himself and says that he had no other choice, because as it seemed to him otherwise, the princess would not have agreed to the adoption. The main character finally realizes why Philip couldn't open up to her. The whole reason is that his birth mother is alive and well, and the boy most likely remembers her very well and misses her. Mad, realizing that his son misses his own mother, tells the princess that since Philip misses her so much, let the princess give her a separate wing so he can see her face once in a while. The protagonist is very surprised at her husband's request for a whole wing for Philip's mother. She wonders what the hell this man thinks of her, after all. She is the first princess of the kingdom. The princess, who is not quite sure what the right thing to do in this situation is, tells her husband that she will send a letter to her father to tell him what the right thing to do is. But her husband interrupted her and said that he had already received permission from His Majesty. The protagonist is very surprised by this, because she does not understand how her father could give this consent, and why he did it. It turned out that Mad had sent a petition to His Majesty in advance, and then the protagonist began to read a letter from her father, and it turned out that the letter said that she should welcome her husband's mistress. At which point the protagonist thinks that this is to be expected because her father is not on her side again. After some time, Courtesan Genia arrived at the residence of the Marquis and occupied a separate wing. Immediately after that, this courtesan began to behave as if she were the mistress of the place, but the protagonist could not prevent it. The courtesan, who has not yet had time to get used to it, immediately began to brag that Mad gave her a beautiful necklace. She wryly asks if this jewelry suits her. The protagonist in turn realizes that she can't stop it because the heartache she feels has begun to destroy her body. As she lies in her bed, she thinks about how hard it is for her. She wishes she could go to sleep and never wake up again. She thinks then she wouldn't have to look at the filthy spectacle that is going on around her. But this was not all the problems that happened in the life of our protagonist. She did not quite realize that ahead of her awaited something much more terrible. Sometime later, morning comes, and the protagonist, who wakes up and sits on her bed, asks her husband why he came to her room again. Mad looks at his wife sarcastically and angrily and asks if there is any place in his house that he is not allowed to enter, and he also asks a very ambiguous question of the main character. He asks her if she should go to the south to regain her strength, as if he were trying to show tenderness, and touches the princess's face. The protagonist immediately pushes his hand away from her face. She is very angry and asks her husband why she should do this, mentioning that first the girl took away her house and now she wants to take her place. Mad, trying to justify his mistress, emphasizes that the protagonist is sick and that she should not blame the girls, who are allegedly not involved in all this. He also wonders whether the protagonist really thinks that this girl is destroying their family. The main character, who is still sitting in her bed, is in complete shock at the words of her husband. She obviously did not expect such words from his side. At that moment, she thinks that her husband doesn't even want to listen to her. And even more, he wants to kick her out of this house, under the pretext of taking care of her health. Mad, in his turn, is a little angry that his wife does not agree with his opinion. He says that she can take her time and advises her to think carefully. But even without finishing his thought, the main character interrupts him and informs him that they are getting a divorce. Mad could not expect anything like this. After Leon informed her husband that they would be divorcing, she finally got peace of mind, and her health also started to improve day by day. But also after this message, husband got up to visit her much more often. Although several times he even humiliated the main character, at one point she even asked him to stop following her, because she is not in the mood at all. She was very confused by the fact that her husband appeared out of nowhere and would not leave her alone, which irritated her a lot and gave her headaches. But it was as if Mad wasn't even going to leave the protagonist alone, smiling as he said that husband and wife should spend more time together. In the opinion of the protagonist, it was as if her husband was simply afraid of divorce, since the title, lands and mines, as well as the residence of the Marquis, would be taken away. But more importantly, besides this, along with all the estates that were gifted by the king, will also be from the disadvantage of his son's status. But in the opinion of the protagonist, it is too late, for she has made the final decision to divorce her husband. At this point, she looks a little thoughtful, but still she stands firm. After some time, she already communicates with her husband in their home. The protagonist tells him that nothing can be changed, and then her husband, pouring her tea, notes that he failed to achieve forgiveness in just 1 week. But according to him, he will try to correct all his mistakes of the last years. Lien, of course, does not give up his principles and still says that he will not be able to change anything, and nothing can make her change her mind. At this point, Mad looks really sad, and after a bit of thought, he says that of course it's not easy to glue broken heart back together. The protagonist, who sips tea, thinks about the fact that sometimes she fell for his kindness, but she wonders if it was love. Lien also mentions that perhaps the news of the divorce will stir up the community for a while, but she thinks that when things calm down, it will be up to the Mad to decide whether or not to bring the two of them into the main building. Suddenly, after these words about the main character begins to bleed from the mouth, she realizes that in the mug of tea that her husband poured her was poison, which he decided to poison her with. Mad, in turn, once again smoking a cigar, reminds the girl that even if he dies, he will not divorce, and he looks very confident, and obviously is not going to lose his new estates and status. The protagonist began to look at her hands, which are already stained with the blood that is drained out of her. At this point, even her vision suffers some changes. Mad still tells his wife that there will be no divorce. He emphasizes that such a scenario is extremely unacceptable for him. Otherwise, Philip will again become the child of a prostitute. At the same time, Mad asks himself why he tolerated until this day and did not do it earlier. The protagonist, who can barely stand on her feet from the last strength, tells her husband that if her father finds out about it, he will not be well. She did not even have time to finish her thought, as Mad interrupted her again. Calling Lien family, he asks her if she still believes the king really loves her. According to him, she never tried to figure out what was going on before her fifth husband died. The main character, who is incredibly shocked and surprised by her husband's words, just stares at him silently and listens to what he says to her. Mad, in turn, tells the girl that her face shows that she doesn't know anything, in his opinion, so it would be better for her to die right now because there is no reason to live for such a dope like her. Coming closer to his wife, he informs her that this is the end, so she should listen to him very carefully. According to Mad, the princess was just used. The protagonist, who is still poisoned, is very surprised by what she hears, but her husband keeps talking and emphasizes that all this time she was just an obedient puppet. According to Mad, she was merely a tool of the king to eliminate enemies and undesirable people, and that was the point of her existence. Still smoking his cigar, he also mocks the princess for not even realizing it. But the main character finally got the whole picture of what was going on, and she now understands everything. Then Mad touches her hair and says he only needed her status to set up his son's future. And he says it just so happens that his interests and her father's coincided. Then her husband tells her that the moment her mother took poison instead of His Majesty and died, he decided to take advantage of His Majesty's worsening paranoid disorder and get rid of the Republican Party. He says he let her live as long as he needed her. And then, when all his goals were accomplished, he finally decided to poison her as well. According to him, it would have been good to kill the Archduke Elegator as well. But thanks to the princess, the troops of the Viscount Barrymouth were in their hands, so now it won't be a problem. After all this, Mad says that Lien has done a good job, and he'd like to tell her a little more about what's going on, but he doesn't think she has time anymore. After all this, reaching out to his wife, he begins to congratulate her and tells her that she has the freedom she has wanted for so long. Obviously, he says this in an apologetic way, then throws a cigar right next to her hair. At this point, the protagonist wonders if she is destined to die like this, and she also wonders that if she had been a little wiser and a little more cautious, things might have been different. Although now she finally realizes that things could have turned out differently even if she hadn't married Mad. At this point, her maid is crying over the body of the protagonist. Suddenly, the protagonist opens her eyes. At this moment, she is in her bed. Obviously, the girl is very surprised that she woke up, although she clearly remembers dying. The girl immediately jumps up on her bed. She looks around and doesn't understand what's going on, because this room was her room a long time ago. She realizes that this room is in the mansion she left 3 years ago, the room of Viscount Barrymouth, her fifth husband. Lien starts touching herself to see if this moment is just a dream, because she can't understand why she's in this place. After that, the protagonist gets out of bed, not still wondering what she is doing here because she is dead. Suddenly, one of the maids enters her room and tells the princess that it is time to get up because the funeral is about to begin. Lien glances at her maid. She is obviously very surprised to see Nail in this place. After all, she was the only person who mourned her death, and who was by her side at that moment. The princess immediately asks Nail to come to her. The maid, of course, obeys her mistress, and after she has drawn the curtains, she asks the princess if she has had a nightmare, for her face is very pale. But the princess is now preoccupied with something else, and immediately decided to inquire where they are at this moment. You can see from the princess's face that she is in some kind of confusion. The maid, of course, also looks a little surprised at this question, and after a short thought replies that they are in Viscount Barrowmouth's mansion. At this point, the protagonist begins to put this puzzle together in her head. She realizes that the maid was talking about a funeral, and on top of that, they are in her fifth husband's mansion, a mansion that disappeared 3 years ago. After she had put the whole puzzle together in her mind, she immediately decided to ask her maid if Viscount Barrowmouth was buried. The maid was, of course, very surprised by this question, but immediately answered the princess that it was so. Lien thinks that everything is happening exactly as she thought. She guesses that she has traveled back in time to the moment when her fifth husband is buried. Suddenly she starts smiling, and after that she immediately starts laughing very loudly in her voice. The maid is very surprised at this, if incomprehensibly looking at the princess. After she finished laughing, she immediately ordered the maid to call all the other maids here, because according to her, you can't keep the guests waiting. After the already dressed protagonist went into the hall, she looked around and saw the usual clothes and atmosphere that makes her breathless. In her opinion, it is nothing new. She goes further down the hall. I open the door to another room, looks around and realizes that the reception room is still the same. Then the protagonist looks in one of the mirrors. She looks at her appearance with surprise and even touches her face a little. At this moment, the protagonist notices that her face seems to shine. But more importantly, she began to think about why she returned to this moment, her questions of the past. The only question in her mind is why she was thrown back in time. She begins to remember the words of her last husband, that all this time she was just an obedient puppet. She remembered that her father had asked her to marry Mad here, which meant that her father would be coming to this room soon, and before she could even finish her thought, she heard footsteps and realized that her father was already here. The king turns to his daughter, as immediately she greeted his majesty and called him the son of the entire kingdom. The girl even bowed a little to her father. She thinks about the fact that everything is happening exactly as it was in her memories, because the king, her future husband who is behind him, has also come to her. The king looks a little sad and tells his daughter that she is very much upset, so much so that she has no face at all, while behind her father sits a pleased Mad, who is evidently already expecting the consummation of their engagement. The main character wonders if her father is so heartless that he took advantage of the aristocrat's desire to possess her. Or perhaps in her opinion, we lied to her to cause her more pain at the end of her life. But whatever, the father is already telling his daughter that they better hurry up the 6th wedding. The main character at first looked a little sad, but then began to smile and thought about what she could expect, because this is reality. She realizes that if she really went back in time, this is her chance to change her life and get revenge. At that moment, she remembers the very moments when she first saw his son, and when he smoked a cigar before her death. Then the protagonist comes out of her thoughts and tells her father that she will not marry. This time, the girl looks quite determined. She just thinks about the fact that she does not want to repeat the same mistakes. The father naturally looks very unhappy with his daughter's answer, but the protagonist immediately begins to explain everything to her father and informs him that her refusal now does not mean that she is not going to do it at all. But according to her, it is not quite appropriate to do it right now because the funeral of her 5th husband has just passed. The king says that his daughter has a right to do so because it is immoral to talk about the next wedding at her husband's funeral. And after these words, the daughter touches her father's hand and asks him not to force her to do so. In this case, the protagonist thinks that most likely the king will think that it is very strange because always obedient daughter went against him. But the king looks at his daughter with a disgruntled expression and notices that she seems to be having a hard time, and asks her how long she needs to recover. He also asks how long she is going to wear the herbs. The main character doesn't show it, but is very happy to hear from her father. She realizes that she has succeeded and asks her father to give her at least a month. She says she thinks that this time will be enough to show respect to her late husband. She also said that in exactly 1 month she would return to the royal palace, after which the king, together with Mad, left. Already inside the carriage, the king said that his daughter had behaved strangely today. Mad says she looked very shabby. The king retorts that she did too, but he's more interested in when his daughter became like that, because according to him, she never interrupted him or defied his will. But according to the king, someone had a bad influence on her. At the same time, the king asks Mad if he has received a report from Lorand. At the same moment, Mad thinks that the princess has been badly influenced by her guard, but he tells the king that no report has come to him yet. The king also asked Mad if there were any new prophecies, but the boy says that the temple has been very quiet lately too. It turns out there was a prophecy on Lien's birthday. It turned out that according to the prophecy, the first star that fell on the earth would create a fire. Then the fire would devour the earth, and the judgment of the kings of the earth would begin. This prophecy is the one that the king is pathologically afraid of, and it is because of it that it is so easy to manipulate. In addition, Mad had no trouble getting the support of the new queen, because she is very jealous of the princess. The king tells Mad that he must increase his daughter's guard and add more maids. He also says that he is sorry for what happened, but that Mad should not be upset and wait a little longer, for he has not forgotten his promise. Mad, of course, obeys his majesty and says he will naturally accomplish all this while imagining the princess being in some sort of cage. The protagonist herself at this moment thinks that there is a case that she needs to avoid at all costs for this month. This case is the marriage with Honey. It also turns out that all the property received after 5 marriages went to the royal treasury, and if she sells the jewelry, the whole about it will be sent to the palace. Since she has no funds, she cannot escape, of course. The protagonist realizes that she needs to find someone who is no match for Mad. But luckily, her memory is fine, and she remembers exactly what the maid said about some men. At the same time, the princess knows that there is one person to whom the king cannot refuse under any circumstances, the one who can accept the princess who ruined 5 husbands. According to the protagonist, it's about a man who has everything she needs right now, and who the protagonist thinks will be able to help her. It is, of course, about the Archduke who has the strongest army. The girl seems to remember the guy talking to the king and tells him that he was personally acquainted with Viscount Barrymouth. The king in turn tells him that he understands everything, and now that the Archduke will leave this place, let him rest properly and return. But the Archduke refuses a well-deserved rest and tells the king that the territory can't be empty for long. And then the king tells him that he has a special request for the guy. At that moment, the protagonist wakes up in her bed and wonders if it was a dream. It turns out she met the Archduke for a moment on the way to her bedroom. She also remembers that on her father's orders, he was to guard her and Mad during their first wedding night. Sometime later came the last day of the funeral. The girl observes everything that is happening and thinks about the fact that on the last day of the funeral, everyone who was supposed to come, except for one single person, has arrived. Suddenly, right after these thoughts, she sees the Archduke in front of her. The girl looks a little confused, but realizes that this is exactly the man she needed. At this time, a boy approaches her, and holding beautiful lilies in his hand. The girl, as soon as she saw him, immediately decided to call him, and the Archduke naturally responded. The guy was a little surprised that the princess called him, and immediately turned to her and asked if something had happened. The protagonist at this point looks a little confused, as if she did not know what to do. But the girl immediately comes to her senses and tells the Archduke that she has a very important conversation with him, after which she sweetly asks him to give her a moment of his time. The guy seems a little annoyed that the princess is distracting him, but tells her that she can tell him what she wants to tell him. The protagonist starts from afar and asks if he is busy. But the guy still coldly answers her and says that of course he is busy. The protagonist thinks she wants to go to ground, but it's her only chance to survive and change her future, because she realizes that if she misses this one chance, she'll have to remarry Mad, and then the nightmare will happen again. The protagonist thinks that if she wasn't ready to fight, she would have committed suicide as soon as she went back in time. According to the main character, she was just waiting for the right moment to radically change her life. And it is for this she needs this man who will help her in this, because he has strength and power. She wants to take advantage of him and divorce him at once. After these thoughts, she goes to the Archduke and tells him she needs some help. The Archduke, who still looks pretty angry, says he was wondering what kind of help the princess needed, who already has everything. The protagonist, seeing the guy's behavior, realizes that what she is going to do is very risky, but she also realizes that she has no other choice. After she thought it over, she immediately asked to be made a duchess. It was obvious from the girl's face that she was talking about all of this seriously. The guy was very much surprised by such a strange request from the princess, and a little thoughtful. Also, at the same time, he did not answer her anything. The girl, seeing that the guy does not answer her, tries to justify her words. But the Archduke says that he will just pretend that he did not hear anything, because according to him, and it seems to him that she has not yet recovered from the loss of her husband. The princess once again tries to justify herself somehow, but the guy insists on his own and wonders if she could otherwise propose to another man right at her own husband's funeral. The main character was very embarrassed after the guy said it was a proposal. Her cheeks turned a little red, and she didn't even know what to say to him. The protagonist finally realizes that the Archduke thought it was about marriage. Of course, she realizes that she meant a proposal of cooperation, but also assumes that he might have thought otherwise. The protagonist looks directly at the Archduke and realizes that there was a very awkward moment between them, because she didn't expect him to think of marriage. But she realizes that she has nowhere else to go, because time is running out, and she needs to get herself safe as soon as possible. And she needs to make sure she doesn't marry mad. She realizes that this is a chance to right her wrong choices she made earlier, and a chance to save her life from imminent doom. She once again turns to the Archduke, but he does not even listen to her to the end. Immediately informs the protagonist that he is leaving. Of course, the princess does not quite agree with this outcome of events, and informs the guy that the conversation is not over yet. But the Archduke is unwavering. He asks the princess, does she really want to make him the sixth corpse? From this rhetoric, we can understand that he fears death as much as anyone else because of his relationship with the princess. The protagonist, in turn, is a bit surprised and upset by what she hears. She immediately states that of course she doesn't want it. Erzurtsov, in turn, says that if she really doesn't want it, the conversation between them is over. Then the protagonist is left all alone in the hall. She realizes that this was a very expected reaction from the Archduke. She recalls that she had heard earlier that Courtesan Elegator has an unbending will, and that this young man also hates the royal family, and she has been the king's loyal puppet all along. The girl looks after the departing guy, and realizes that this task will probably be very difficult. But if he instantly agreed, she would doubt his firmness of character. The girl still looks very sad, but she realizes that she still has some time to convince the Archduke to accept her proposal. Sometime later, already being in her office, the princess calls the maid and informs that she needs to go to the vault. Of course, the maid is a little surprised by such a question, but the princess is firmly on her way. She explains her decision by the fact that it was the property of Viscount Barrymouth, who had not been moved to the royal palace, and it turned out that all the property left by her 4 previous husbands was the property of the royal family and was to be transferred to the royal palace. Naturally, after all this, the protagonist was not given a single penny, but she has never complained about something similar. Immediately after that, she once again turns to her maid. She told her that she wanted to get her dead husband's fortune, apparently to start a new life and move away. Naturally, the maid is very surprised at this. Naturally, the main character also decided to explain why she needs the riches of her ex-husband, because she did not need anything and she has all the wealth, but she didn't really own anything in her life, and everything the princess owned was her father's property, and she was fed up with it. Also, according to her, because the funeral is over, servants from the royal palace will soon arrive to take away all those things that belonged to her ex-husband. Because the maid is well aware that the princess owns nothing, she doesn't ask too many questions and wonders if she can be of any use to her mistress. Right after that, the princess starts reading some document, and it turns out that the Viscount had a huge army. Even though he was just a Viscount, he managed to gather a huge army. At this point, the princess wonders if the king and Mad know about it. And she also thinks about the fact that she doesn't have as much time left as she was supposed to have, because she has a lot of unfinished business. Parallel to this, the Archduke finally arrived. Instead of where he was going, after he jumped off his horse, he immediately inquired of one of his subjects where His Majesty was. But in reply, the young Archduke heard that according to some reports, the king had gone at once to the palace. The Archduke is obviously not very pleased with this action, and thinks about what is happening. He remembers that the king said he had a request for him, but having left without saying a word, he begins to think that there is something wrong here. Suddenly, the same subject asks his leader if he is hurt. The Archduke, who still looks very glum, wonders why he should be hurt, but the guy just says that maybe it could be because the Archduke was with Her Highness. The Archduke is a bit surprised by this, and asks his subject if he understood correctly that this guy means to say that the princess is a cannibal. The young subject is surprised by this question and says that he doesn't mean that. But the already pissed off Archduke says that apparently the guy has a lot of energy to spend on asking stupid questions and keeping stupid conversations going. The servant says that of course this is not true, but the unbending Archduke informs him that after they return home, the amount of their training will be increased 5-fold. Of course, this soldier is very much surprised by such a statement. Already, after some time to the Archduke, who is in his office, another of his subjects comes in. I turn to his commander. He asks what happened in the mansion because apparently the Archduke is very worried. The boy answers nothing, and looking meaningfully out the window at the sunset, to his subject that nothing unusual had happened in the mansion, and there was only a widow who was mourning the loss of her husband. He begins to think that the princess's grief was so great that she even lost her mind over it. But remembering the girl's face and behavior at that moment, the Archduke decides that it wasn't like madness. Suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by the same subject who had earlier entered his office. The boy opened the door and told his lord that a man from the palace had come to see him. Hearing this, the lord ordered the man who had come to see him to enter his office. Immediately afterwards, the young and rather self-assured Mad enters his office and tells the Archduke that they have not seen each other for a long time. Also immediately afterwards, holding some document in his hand, he tells the Archduke that he has a message for him from His Majesty, and then immediately orders the young man to tell him what the message is. It appears the king has given orders for the Mohan's army to postpone their return and await orders from His Majesty. The Archduke and his subject looking a little surprised at such news. But the guy who came with the message keeps talking and announces that in a month's time there will be a lavish royal wedding, and the Archduke's job is to guard the temple during the wedding ceremony. According to him, the marriage ceremony should go off without any problems or irregularities. It is obvious that the king has already pre-planned his daughter's marriage to the Maida. The assumption that this wedding would be the wedding of the first princess was justified. Because of this news, the Archduke was left speechless. After a short silence, the Archduke turns to Honey. He tells him that in 4 days, the heart of the Belgor's forest will open. Then he asks who will stop the monsters if Mr. Muhannes leaves. This question was starting to irritate Mad a bit, and even stumped him for a while. But he immediately asked the Archduke if there was any other person who could stop the monsters besides him. The self-confident Archduke reports that this is the case, and that there is no one in this empire but he who can handle the influx of monsters that is expected. But Mad decides to put a little pressure on the Archduke. He asks the guy, "What will be the king's disappointment if even the 6th husband of the first princess is found dead right after the first night? Right after that, he says that the Archduke's help will be needed exactly 1 month later in the palace, and only 1 day." The Archduke, who is famous for his unwavering will, confidently tells Mad that it is impossible to fulfill the king's task. His answer obviously displeases Mad. He once again tries to appeal to the Archduke, but the Archduke doesn't even let him finish, and tells him that he is free to go. He also tells his subject to escort the counselor out, immediately after which the counselor grabs Mad's arm and is about to escort him out, thus fulfilling his commander's orders. As he leaves, the disgruntled maid turns around and looks directly at the Archduke, who sits motionless in his chair, as if he is not even concerned about not following the king's orders. At this time, it was night outside, and to the house in which the protagonist was, some unattended carriage drove up. The girl approached it, and one of the butlers asked her if she was really going to go instead of her destination in this carriage. The girl next to her maid said it was all right, and they had prepared everything they needed for the trip. She is well aware that she and her maid are under suspicion. It turns out that this morning the new knights and maids that the emperor sent to guard them arrived, but she thinks they came here just to watch her. Also, afterwards, the protagonist tells the butler that she hopes everything will be fine until they return. According to her, they should not reveal that the palace is empty. Right after this dialogue, the carriage in which the princess and her maid are traveling, at which time the maid who is with the princess tells her not to worry about what is happening. According to the maid recently arrived, people had a party last night and she gave them some wine. The princess is surprised by this act of her maid, but she adds that the wine was mixed with sleeping pills, and soon all these people will fall asleep, and they will be back before they wake up. Naturally, the princess praises her maid for these forward-thinking actions. Already. After a while, they finally arrive at their destination, and the maid helps her mistress out of the carriage. The girls came to some big house, which did not look at all like a palace as it was before. After they looked at this house, the princess told her maid to stay here, for she would go on alone. Apparently, the maid is not very happy about this. She asks the princess if she is really going to go on alone. After all, it is too dangerous for her life. But the princess says that's not true at all, because it's much more dangerous for two people to move together. And she says that as soon as she returns, the maid must go back in the carriage. But the maid is still wary of the princess's plan, and to keep her safe, gives the princess a beautiful sword. The princess is naturally very surprised to be given a sword, but the maid says that if something happens, she can use this sword and escape, and the maid says that she has already applied a paralyzing poison to the sword. According to the maid, and her brother is studying botany, and that is why she asked him for this paralyzing poison. The protagonist once again thanks her maid for her help, and says that she will take care of this sword. At this time, the Archduke is still communicating with Mad. He asks Mad if he really doesn't know what's going on in Mohannis. Also, according to him, the monsters have no interest in human affairs at all. As the princess walks up the stairs to what appears to be the same house, she thinks that it would have been better if she had prepared in advance for this meeting. She reaches the door and hears the Archduke talking. They are still talking about monsters, and the Archduke says that the Cathedral of Belgorsa cannot be closed. Then Mad contradicts him once again and asks if the wedding of the first princess can be postponed. Obviously, there is some irony in this question. The protagonist continues to listen and hears that the Archduke's army will be sent back. The protagonist seems to recognize someone's voice as she eavesdrops behind them. After all this conversation, the protagonist thinks that it would have been better if the Archduke had stayed here, while Mad is about to leave the Archduke's room, and the protagonist finally recognizes whose voice it was. As the Archduke's aide escorts Mad to the exit, the Archduke calls out to him. But the departing guy says he's already conceded, so now he's waiting for some concessions from the Archduke. At this time, the protagonist hid away from Mad's eyes. She remembers that when he came to the funeral with the Emperor, she purposely pretended not to see him. She also said if Mad had dared to look at her, she would have stuck a knife right between his eyes. The protagonist is still in hiding, but she is already holding the sword that the maid gave her. She is thinking that she wants to kill Mad very badly, even now, with the sword that the maid gave her. Suddenly, the Archduke grabs the protagonist by the arm and says that someone overheard their conversation after he turned the girl to face him. He immediately took off her hood to see who was hiding under it. The protagonist was very much frightened, and the Archduke in turn was in a stupor because he did not expect to see the princess. He immediately got angry and began to ask the girl what she was doing in this place. Of course, the main character could not immediately orient herself and give an answer to his question. But the Archduke holds the girl by the shoulders and tells her that this is a very dangerous place, because it is full of armed knights who are ready to go into battle at any moment. Also, according to him, the princess could be perceived as an enemy, because she broke in here for no reason. But the protagonist, as if he did not listen to him, and only thought that he was too close. Then she asks the Archduke if he would believe her if she said there was something more terrible than even death. The Archduke initially hesitated a bit and didn't even know what to say. But then the protagonist also mentioned that if she couldn't convince him of something, it would be the death of her. Then she begins to justify her actions by saying that she doesn't care where she dies. Whether it's death in the palace, in her own room, or death in this house, it doesn't matter to her. Suddenly, the Archduke is once again called by Mad. He asks the Archduke to once again consider his proposal. At this time, the protagonist hides behind the guy so that Mad does not notice her. From the Archduke's reaction, we can understand that he is not satisfied. He also asks Mad what else he wants him to concede. At this time, the protagonist still overhears their conversation, but Mad says that the Archduke should give an answer quickly and tell everything to the king. Then he says that he is going to leave. The Archduke says he understands the boy, then bids him farewell. After he has said goodbye to Mad, he looks after him to make sure he leaves his house. He turned to the princess and asked her about the dangerous place she had mentioned earlier. Realizing that the conversation is finally going in the right direction, the princess turns to the guy and says that he really must save her from destruction. On hearing this, the Archduke immediately decided to inquire whether he had correctly understood that the princess was now threatening her own death. But the girl was not confused and immediately decided to ask him if he thought this threat would work. But the Archduke, instead of answering her question, listed all her ex-husbands who had died. After he finished listing the entire list, he asked truth. Now it was his turn to die after marrying the princess. Without hearing an answer, he immediately grabs the girl by the shoulder and asks if the king ordered her to do it. But the protagonist said that she came here voluntarily. When the Archduke hears this, he turns his back on the protagonist and tells her that it doesn't matter, because he has heard that her 6th marriage will take place in a month. The main character blushed a little because of this and wondered what they even thought of her. She thinks everyone around her is crazy, including even the king. But the guy interrupts her from these thoughts and informs her that he does not need such a marriage at all. Also immediately after that, as if reading the thoughts of the protagonist, he wonders if any of the Marquis was crazy. Also, already the Archduke is thinking about what is happening. He realizes that they have not even been told who is the man who will marry the princess. He thinks that perhaps it will be known only on the day of the wedding. But even if it will be so, he is still sure. The protagonist at this time says that everything is exactly as the Archduke said, and in a month she will really marry some Marquis, while she once again emphasizes that if he does not agree to marry her, she will die. This speech does not impress the Archduke. He emphasizes that the princess is still talking about the same thing, and looks at her very intently. At this time, the girl's eyes became glassy, and she seems to want to cry. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and she thinks a little. After a short silence, she said that she would help the kingdom ruled by the Archduke to become independent. But he was not impressed by this, and smiling, the boy asked if the girl really thought that they could not achieve independence on their own. The princess once again tries to justify her words and says that she never thought so, but at the same time she thinks about the fact that as far as she knows before her death, this kingdom never achieved independence. And it turned out that from the time of the ancient ancestors to the present Archduke, this kingdom never became an independent state, because the king could not lose this land so easily. Even after her death, the troops that used to belong to her 5th husband defected to the emperor's side, and independence was impossible. Knowing all this, the princess wonders if this kingdom can be as independent as the kingdom of Bali. Apparently these words affected the guy, and he asked the girl what she wanted him to do. But the protagonist said nothing but that she needed 3 years to make this kingdom independent. She also emphasizes that at the end of the term she will leave the kingdom, but these words do not close all the questions of the guy, and he wonders, why should she suddenly become Archduchess? Because he says he cannot give such a title to a person whom he does not trust at all. Looking at the guy, Princess thinks that Erzherzog is clearly not the person who can be so easily fooled. She realizes that in this case there is only one way out, which is to tell him the truth. After the princess had gathered her courage, she declared that she no longer wanted to be His Majesty's puppet, looking quite confident, and her hand clenched into a fist. The pensive guy looks out the window and notices that they have even prepared a carriage for the trip back. But the protagonist does not lose hope that she can persuade the guy to marry her, and says that if he wants to, she will help him to sanalize the marriage, According to her, his property will not suffer and they will not affect the honor of the family to which he belongs. While the princess is leaving the place, the Archduchess is still watching her carriage. He thinks about the fact that he knows very well that this is a very dangerous place. But he did not accompany her. He also realizes that she risked her life when she came here. The Archduke then turns to his assistant and asks him what kind of person the first princess is. The butler says that her name is Lien, and she is a doll that the king raised and a potted flower. The aide also reports a very interesting fact to his king. He says that all 5 marriages were to courtiers from the same family. According to him, this is not a coincidence, but he also asks the king what he thinks about it. The Archduke in turn reflects that there is no evidence that the king used the princess. In his opinion, it was the decision of the nobles themselves to send a request for marriage to the palace. He also thinks about the fact that the king did not insist on the marriage. But he also realizes that of course they cannot be sure that the marriage for the princess was not under pressure from her father. Right after these thoughts, the guy tells his butler that in a month she will marry for the 6th time. The butler is naturally a little surprised by such news and says that it is really impressive because not even a year has passed. In his opinion, only a fool would decide to marry her. But the Archduke decides to reveal a little secret to his assistant. According to him, the princess told him that the 6th husband will be mad. The butler is naturally very surprised by this. He asks, does he know correctly that Mad is a member of the royal family? But the Archduke doesn't answer anything and just broods over the whole situation. It turned out that at that moment he was remembering their conversation with the princess. Then the girl asked him if he thought it was strange, but when she left, she told him that she was going to give them an answer, so she would wait. And the girl once again mentioned that she didn't have much time. At the same time, the princess and her maid are rushing home. The maid asks the princess what happened while she was away, but the girl says that everything went pretty well. When the maid heard this, she was a little happy and immediately asked her princess if she was tired, and also said that when they came back she would make her a very fragrant tea. Seeing the kindness of her maid, the princess is very happy and says that of course she will be very happy and will wait for the delicious tea. But suddenly she notices something strange behind the carriage and thinks that something is obviously wrong. It turns out that their carriage has already returned to the house in which she lived earlier. And looking outside, she sees that there are a lot of royal knights who are walking around the yard. Seeing all this, the princess guesses that she is caught. Realizing this, she is immediately excited and tells her maid to go back and give the letter to the Archduke. But the maid does not fully understand what she is going to do and asks her directly about it. After the princess climbs out of the carriage, she orders her maid to leave, because if she doesn't right now, the king will find her wherever she is and take her back, even if he has to search the entire continent to do it. Also, according to the princess, after they catch her maid, they will take away this letter and everything will be lost. She says that her life is now in the hands of her maid, then once again tells her to run away. Hearing all this and seeing the desperation of the princess, the maid even begins to cry a little. The princess also says that if she is safe, the maid will receive something as a dowry. She suggests that perhaps the contents of this document might interest the Archduke. At this time, all the people who had been looking for the princess earlier started talking loudly about the fact that they had finally found her. The girl herself came straight to them and pulled down the hood from her head. The action of the story immediately moves to the Archduke. His butler informs him that a man has come to see him, who says he has been here recently. The butler also mentions that this girl says that she is the princess's maid, and since he has seen her and her carriage in person, it seems to him that this is not a lie, and there is a maid right in front of the door who is in tears. The girl immediately handed the document to the guy and informed him that she had brought it on behalf of the princess. After he opened this document, the guy's face expressed very much displeasure and perhaps even concern. The princess thinks about the fact that after 3 years she has returned to the palace where she lived before. In her opinion, she should have fooled the emperor better and should have acted more carefully and more attentively. Though in doing so, she realized that he must have had doubts right after she refused to marry for the 6th time. In the girl's opinion, it was inevitable. Lying on her bed, the protagonist tries to calm herself down somehow. She tries to convince herself that it's not her fault and that it's not the end. But you can see from the girl's face that she's not sure of anything anymore. Suddenly the door to her room opens, and she is called by a man. The girl immediately gets up on the bed and sees that in the doorway is already Lord Mad. The guy came up to the girl without any ceremony and sat down next to her. At that moment she felt some concern, and even thought about the fact that he sat down next to her. The girl once again leaves her thoughts and tells herself that she must endure because everything is still in her hands. From excitement, once again, the protagonist clenches her fist. Mad starts talking and says that she was rumored to have left the mansion last night, to which the princess immediately asks if he is spying on her. But Mad excuses you and says that he was not spying. He also wryly emphasizes that he did not know that protection and surveillance have the same meaning. But the girl says that it was not necessary. After all, no one would dare to endanger her, because she is the daughter of His Majesty the Emperor and the first princess of the Empire. But Mad, even in this situation, finds the right answer and says that it was done to protect her from all the dangers that may await her. The protagonist a little thought and said that it seems that she really worried His Majesty. Mad says it is true that His Majesty has been up all night worrying about his daughter's whereabouts. But the princess realizes that he was awake not because he was worried about her, but because he was anxious and very angry. Also, according to Mad, His Majesty will be here soon, and the princess will have to confess that she made a mistake when she left the palace. When the protagonist's face changed, she said that she thought she could live freely until she returned to the imperial palace, and realizing what she had done, she immediately asked her future husband if His Majesty was angry. Mad Bud is kind of happy that the princess is becoming more compliant, and states that he will talk to His Majesty, so that when His Majesty arrives, she should just not bother him anymore. At which time a smirk is visible on the guy's face. The protagonist says that she agrees to it and she will do as he tells her, with the protagonist looking very worried and thinking that she feels pretty bad. Mad shakes the dust off his shoulder as if to say that he's happy with the way things turned out, and then he tells the princess that she can rest easy, mentioning that he's heard that she hasn't taken her medication in a week, even though he told her not to skip it. Immediately after this conversation, her maid comes up to her and hands her a medicine. The girl also realizes that this is the medicine Mad told her to take. The protagonist thinks that this medicine, which Mad gave her daily, she was told that it should help to clear the mind and spirit, as well as to calm the body. And she noticed that it did, for after drinking it for a while, her troubled mind became calm and peaceful. Seeing that the princess hesitates to drink the medicine or not, Mad starts to encourage her to drink it, while the princess just looks at the mug with it. Dear friends, and this is the end of our beautiful story. If you want to see the continuation, then be sure to subscribe to the channel and do not forget to click the like under this video. When under it will accumulate 40,000 views or 5,000 likes, I will definitely make for you the next part. And for those who have been with me up to this point, a little spoiler. Now preparing the next part of the manga, My Husband's Mistress, and also another very interesting manga. Do not miss.